Okay, everyone, good afternoon. This is Art Shed with the show Let's Be Reasonable. Of course, folks, we are in episode number 5 of our 5-part expose. What is wrong with the right? Okay, so we told you, hey, man, with all this winning that they're racking up in court cases and everything else, why are they still so full of rage and despair? And my notion is that whatever the rage and despair is, it is underwritten by an economic event, something that must be happening to them. And that's what we have sought to find out. What is this event that's happening to them? So we went through 4 episodes, and I'll give you the highlights of the 4 episodes. In episode 1, we talked about the factions that make up the Republican Party. We told you that right now, the face of the party is the populist wing of the party. The typology for this group of people, least educated, and of course, the highest concentration of rural individuals that make up the populist right. I told you also, don't sleep on the faith and flag conservatives because, this is what we generally or used to refer to as the Christian coalition. I have a sneaky suspicion that underneath it all, the populist group may be the face, but underneath it all, it's the Christian coalition that is, you might say, writing most of the script that you hear and see, because it still has the same type of jingle. But anyway, those are your things to watch out for and look for in the 5 factions. I'll also note that, remember, for a number of years, it was the committed conservatives or the neocons that pretty much ran the party. They were the face of the party. And they too were getting their marching orders from the Christian coalition. So that's the reason why I say don't sleep on the Christian coalition, because after it's all said and done, they truly may be running the Republican right. So anyway, that was episode 1. In episode 2, we talked about supply side economics from the lens, very top level, right? So we went from 1930s to 1970s, during, you might say, a Keynesian experience where a lot of government influence was noted out throughout, you might say, the business environment, where you saw maybe some degree of tariffs, you saw some degree of price controls, you saw some degree of wages, right? Now, during this period of time, I do tell you again that it did create the largest middle class in American history. Okay. So something to say, yeah, this is happening. There may be some negative things there, but there are some positive items being generated as well. Unemployment for African Americans, too, was at an all-time low during this particular period. So great things happened during the Keynesian environment. However, Republicans sought to change the paradigm, and they wanted a supply-driven economy. And most people refer to it as trickle-down economics or supply side economics, whatever you want to refer to it as. The system says, hey, you know what? When it comes to supply and goods and services, we want to drive down that cost, make it easy for Americans to be able to purchase it at a lower cost, right? And with that, that's going to drive other commerce in the country. Now, that has to be offset by incentives. And we relied on Art Laffer and the Laffer curve, an architect of supply side economics, to tell us about the incentives. And of course, he told us about cutting taxes, cutting regulation, cutting spending. Talked about some free market capitalism, world trade, right? And we talked about the monetary supply. Now, we didn't really deal with free markets and monetary supply. We dealt specifically regarding the tax picture, cutting taxes, cutting spending, and cutting regulation. But at a top level, what I wanted you to understand in episode 2 was that supply side economics, not top driven, it's bottom driven. It favors the individual, and it truly favors the individual who is interested in, well, taking some risk. So if you are taking risk, then by prescription, you're doing the bidding of supply side economics, and it can be rewarding. Okay, so you might have Democrats that will say that supply side economics favors the rich over the poor. Um, Look, that is a byproduct of it. However, I believe it's better said that it favors the individual over the collective. All right. So in episode 3, we began to dispel some of the myths of supply side economics. First and foremost, the cutting taxes narrative generally meant that when you cut taxes, it creates more revenue. However, we know that that is not the case. We have 40 plus years of information, statistical information to draw on and tell you that that is definitely not the case, right? We also know that Republicans, when they're in office, they don't have the propensity to want to cut spending either. They talk about it, but they never really get around to doing it. So that probably is one of the biggest reasons that supply side economics is doomed because, well, I mean, you can't even get the architects of the system to abide by the system. All right. So there's that problem. And then, of course, we talked about the fact that with supply side economics, cutting taxes, since you don't have revenue, it creates deficits. When the government doesn't have enough revenue to run, they have to run deficits. And if you can't get those deficits closed out by the 30th of September, that becomes a debt, something that's lumped onto the national debt, which currently right now is about $34 trillion. Now, keep this also in mind that during this era of supply side economics from 1980 going forward, we have seen the national debt explode. Prior to that, during the Keynesian model, you didn't see it. Okay. Now, we can argue whether or not it's because of supply side economics, but I'm here to tell you, for the sake of this argument, it is because of supply side economics that you have a lot of the debt that you do have. Now, couple the debt and the deficits, or add to the debt, you have to include the bailouts because with every regulation that is, well, deregulation that happens, I should say, you have seen bailouts, right? So the S&L scandal bailouts during the 1980s paved the way for other bailouts, even for nations like Mexico, South Korea, Indonesia during the 90s, right? And then you had the great collapse, the Great Recession that took place in 2008, and of course, COVID that took place in 2020. And each time we do this bailout, it's more money. So, for example, we may have spent $200 million bailing out the S&L crisis, right? However, when you get to the 2008 crisis, I mean, it's in the magnitude of like $2 trillion that you're spending in order to bail, $2 to $4 trillion that you're spending to bail out these corporations, Fannie and Freddie, and everybody else, right? During that period. And then, of course, when you get to COVID, again, a magnitude probably 2 or 3 times, right? So now you're looking at 7 to maybe $14 trillion that you're putting on the U.S. credit card. Again, debts increase dramatically under supply side economics. That was in episode 3. Now, look, by the time we get to episode 4, we started dealing with the congressional maps. And it was important for us to be mindful of what it is that we're looking at, right? So we noticed that we had the map or quadrant was broken down into 4 quadrants. And then, of course, you had the income was based on 2021 numbers. The margin of victory was based on the 2022 midterms. And remember, the 2022 midterms, Republicans were supposed to walk away with that. I mean, they were looking at getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 60 seats in the House. However, that did not happen. In fact, they held on by a very narrow majority, much narrower than Nancy Pelosi's Democrat victories during the 2018 cycle. All right, so that being said, what the maps showed us was that Democrat districts are much wealthier than Republican districts. And of course, I did tell you that this is where we start to see some interesting things about supply side economics, because you have to remember that supply side economics was brought to you by the Republican Party, right? However, it seems as if the beneficiaries of supply side economics have been Democrat districts, especially when you get above $71,000. In this case, that's the median household income in 2021, right? $71,000 going up favors Democrat districts. And I got to tell you, for a system that favors Republicans, I find this to be hard to believe. All right. And it's a very interesting concept when you think about the fact that Democrats didn't even want supply side economics. Right. And the reason why they didn't want supply side economics, especially during the 70s, remember, they built a Keynesian system, pretty much ran by Democrats, built the largest group of middle class Americans. Right. And why would they want anything to compete with that large group of middle class Americans? But Republicans won the 1980 election, and off we went with supply side economics. Now, the byproduct of supply side economics during that period was we did see jobs in the manufacturing sector where Democrats, this is where the Democrat stronghold was, in the manufacturing sector, where 1 in 3 jobs in America were manufacturing jobs and were union jobs, right? So why would Democrats be troubled by that? Because they're going to erode that base. And that is what happened. The manufacturing base soon, by 2000, had eroded from 19 million jobs down to like 13, about 13 million jobs. Okay. And by the time you get to the Great Recession, we're down to 11 million manufacturing jobs. All these jobs outside of the United States, in places like China, in Mexico, in Canada, and other parts in between. All right, now look, all of that brought to you by supply side economics. There is no doubt. It isn't the communists that is doing this to you. It is not the socialists that are running rampant in America that's doing this to you. Ladies and gentlemen, all of this is supply side economics. So, when you look at episode 5, and we're doing a wrap, right? We told you everything that's happening in episodes 1 through 4. When we look at episode 5, you have to stop and really consider some things. Let's back up from the table and take a look at this from a long range or a long lens. Let's go out 70 years again. And again, I tell you, what they are truly upset about is the economics. And as I show you with the maps, there's a concentration of individuals, left and right, but I'm concentrating more on the right because remember, the system was designed for them, and yet they're not taking advantage of the system. But this concentration of people, they're gerrymandered in most cases into these districts. So Republicans created these districts. So you might ask yourself, are they aware that they are creating this less wealthy district or districts? And the answer to that question is definitely yes. Now, again, I back out and look at the longer lens, and I tell you, if you go back 70 plus years, Republicans have traditionally had a problem with how they see the economic picture. Now, in order to make their case, they talked about back then women going into the workforce. They talked about minorities, right, being great, more of a presence or involved in the workforce, and prosperity in those particular areas. They talked about all the different things. Guess what, folks? That we're still talking about to this day. But all of that was to mask the economic situation. Back then, the economic situation was that, well, this thing is getting away from us. So, in order to whip it into shape, we needed to rely on guys like McCarthy to tell us that communism is the problem. He had a list of 200 names or better of communists running agencies. Scare tactic. Then you had the John Birch Society, which, they looked at civil rights and was like, these Negroes are trying to take over, right? Scare tactic. And you had the Christian Coalition. The Christian Coalition, there, everything was about Satanism, and you see that with the Illuminati and the rest of that today. But they also, gave us a lot of fear mongering when it came to banking. It was the New World Order and how it was going to turn America into Satanism and all the rest of it, right? So all of these things are fear tactics, but they're fear tactics in order to be able to rage the machine. And that's what they do. But at the end of the day, we see the problem is really an economic problem. They're saying all of these things, but they're ultimately trying to control the economics. And again, I go back to these districts being gerrymandered and I ask the question, do you think that they understand that by gerrymandering these districts, they're creating less competitive, less wealthy Republican districts? And the answer to that question is definitely again, yes, they know this. So you might ask the question, why do they do this today? It's for the same reason they did it back then. It's about control. And you have guys, I mean, you could talk about Newt Gingrich not willing or wanting to compromise with the left, which created divisions in the House of Representatives and Congress, right? Before then, guys like Tip O'Neill were able to sit down and eat dinner with a Ronald Reagan. They had differences when it came to policy, but at the end of the day, they were still friends, right? And you had guys like Ronald Reagan, and I can tell you Boehner, and all these guys. They were willing to coalesce around the craziness in their party. John Boehner had to deal with the Tea Party people, right? Ronald Reagan really had to deal with the Christian Coalition. So there were crazy notions that were being floated that you could point to and say, well, you knew that these things were not true, but they needed that particular base of people in order to be able to get elected. And wow, I mean, getting elected also means that you can control those census maps because every 10 years, if Republicans are in control, and I'm going to tell you, since 2000, they've pretty much been in control of the maps. So therefore, they have been in control of gerrymandering these districts. So again, I tell you, they are highly aware of the situation. Why do they do it? It seems as if they need to have a body of people to control. And you can't control them if they're highly educated. And that's what you do see. Highly educated people can see through that and say to themselves, well, that ain't right. Well, that's pretty stupid. Give you an example. See, I can sit down and have a conversation with individuals on the far left. And if they want to sit down and talk to me about climate change, whatever you want to call it, global warming, I know what it is they're saying. I don't need, to get bogged down in the semantics. Ultimately, I know you're saying that there are some changes that are happening in our global society that may be man made or man driven. Okay, I'll go along, right? And the reason why I can go along is because, yes, I too see what's happening in places like Florida and the Gulf Coast. I see that. I see what's happening in places like California and those western states that are drying up. I see that. I see the water coming down from the Colorado River that's drying up. Those things are happening now. Do you deserve to get $100 billion in order to um, fix the problem? No, but I can concede you maybe 5 billion. Okay, give me, I'll give you 5 billion, and then let's press and see if this is really actually happening. If we can make some changes in this with this $5 billion, okay, we can go a little further. That's me working with the left. I have, even though I may not agree with the overarching picture, I can still find the logic in their discourse and can say, okay, I can go along with that. Now, by contrast, on the right, when you start talking to me about transgender, gay people, CRT, and the rest of this, I mean, I say to myself, um, what the hell are you talking about? Because you're looking at this as if it never has happened in American society. And I'm here to tell you, it's been going on since the very beginning of society. So, Why are we all up in arms about this? I don't know. Why are we talking about sex education for third graders or banning sex education for third graders when it's not even happening? Why are we talking about banning CRT, critical race theory, at the high school and the elementary school level when it's not even happening? So the things that they bring up in certain cases are imaginary, or they're things that have been there all the time. They're not going away. So if you needed money for that, I'm here to tell you. I say just leave well enough alone and maybe you'll be okay. And again, I go back to this notion about people who do well economically. Guess what? They really don't care about a lot of other stuff. I mean, it's hard for people who do well economically to sit down and get really emotionally worked up about things that aren't even happening. But for people that have an axe to grind, that are told that everything that's going wrong with you is because of someone else, guess what? They're very loud about it. And that's what I have a problem with. And that's what I see with a lot of Republicans. Convince me with your argument. That's what I'm asking. Convince me with your argument. But in most cases, like I said, I had a conversation, with some people this weekend. We were golfing, and they didn't even know what supply side economics was. But we also talked about the issue of abortion, and my stance on abortion is this. Now it's an issue that doesn't involve me because I'm not a woman. I'll say that right off the bat. Okay. But when I look at people that argue against it, I often ask the question, would you think different if it were you? And I'm often alarmed by how much they stammer and uh, project and assume that that would never be the case. Which tells me, since they have a hard time answering the question, that it would be different if it were them. So I see situations there where they say things are good enough for me here, but not good enough for you. Or it's okay for me, but not okay for you. Or don't tread on me, right? But by God, I'm going to tread on you. And it's that, folks, that I find to be a little odd. But at the end of the day, we're coming to the close of episode 5. I think you see, or maybe you may require more convincing, but it is economic. Everything that they choose to have an axe against or grind against or some type of problem with, it all comes back to economics. And for a group of people who have a supply side economic system that is supposed to favor them, it is odd that it favors Democrats. But it probably, again, favors Democrats because it's hard to fool people who have some degree of education, some degree of critical thinking. And that's where we find ourselves today. Now, what will happen on the other side of 2024's election? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. Should be prepared to be able to move either way. If you're truly going to advance in this supply side economic system, you need to be able to be nimble enough to move either way. So, when it comes to sources of information, just know that Fox got sued last year by Dominion. And I think it was an $800 million judgment, right? But during that case, remember, they didn't call themselves a news organization. They called themselves an entertainment organization. So if they're not a news organization, that just tells you that they're not really interested in telling you anything that's true, but they're interested in getting you riled up. Unlike what people refer to as mainstream media. You know what? If they get in trouble, they generally will issue a retraction, or they're trying to escape being fined by the FC or FTC, not Fox, because it's all about entertainment, not OAN, and not Newsmax, because it's all about the entertainment. They're not interested in telling you the truth. They're interested in getting you riled up and creating a bunch of rage and madness. Okay? But that's just me. And I'm not here to say this because I don't like Republicans, because I do. But I know the difference between people who are, everybody says the same thing. So I know they're getting their information from the same source. Therefore, it's not organic. Okay? It's being hand pressed and hand fed to them. So I just believe that it's a group of people that's being managed. And they just don't like people that have the ability to critically think, which is sad. And I'll tell you this, I'm closing. I really am. Have you noticed that Democrats like STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and Republicans really don't? Again, it speaks to they want a class of people who are less educated. So they get a class of people who are less educated, but they need to be controlled. So keep feeding them that stuff and keep them mad at the other side for, it's really strange too. Because, I had a coach when I was a kid playing football. He always told me that excuses were for losers. So when I hear people start to blame other people for their misfortune, I can hear my coach in the back of my head saying excuses are for losers. And that just tells me whatever it is he's complaining about, don't believe him. Because at the end of the day, we're the architects of our own madness. And the sooner we can get back to policy as a nation, the better off we'll be.